Well, with that, let me turn to this evening's speaker, the one you've really all come to hear, and the documentary we're about to see. Mike CHINOY, I think many of you know, longtime member of the club, now still a member, is a life-absent member. Former Beijing bureau chief for CNN, former senior South Asia correspondent, former senior Asia correspondent for CNN. He's been going all over the world to gather footage for tonight's documentary. And with that, I give you Mike.
Thanks very much, Keith. I'm delighted to be here. We were talking at dinner about my early memories of joining the FCC as a fledgling reporter in 1976 and remembering the large looming presence of Richard Hughes holding court at the bar in Sutherland House down in Central a long time ago. And it's nice to see so many old friends tonight. Let me tell you just a bit about this film and the project that we're doing at the U.S.-China Institute, which is part of the Annenberg School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. We're working on what will eventually be an 8-part documentary film series on the history of American correspondence in China from the 1940s to the present day. The premise behind the project is that the way in which the American media have covered China over all these years has really been responsible for shaping the way in which the American public and political class have understood or misunderstood China. Moreover, given the clout of organizations like the New York Times, the networks, the wire services, what American news organizations have reported about China has had a disproportionate impact on the way many people in many parts of the world, how they understand China. So we thought there would be real value in trying, in effect, to tell the story of the people who have told the China story over the years. As many of you who are journalists will know, there is often a disconnect among news consumers between what you see on TV or read in your newspaper or online and how that material got there. But anybody who's been in or around the news business will know that the way in which the story is reported, the process of covering the news, what the reporters actually do on the ground to get that story, to understand it, to write it, to transmit it, and so on, can have a decisive impact in shaping the kind of story that comes out. And that's a side that many people are unfamiliar with. And so we are looking, starting with the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s, and then going through the 2 decades in which Hong Kong was the base for China watching, as American and most other journalists were frozen out of the People's Republic, from the Nixon visit all the way up to the present day. The Nixon trip clearly deserves attention on its own. It was, of course, a hugely important diplomatic breakthrough, but it was also a milestone in terms of journalism. In 1972, when Nixon went to China, American journalists, along with most other Western journalists, had effectively been frozen out of the People's Republic since the Revolution of 1949. But because of Nixon's trip, the Chinese agreed to allow nearly 100 of the biggest names in the American media world to accompany Nixon. And they also agreed to allow the kind of coverage that they had never done before. But it was a very ambitious and complicated undertaking, and I like to characterize what you're going to see in this film as the collision of 3 alien civilizations: the Nixon White House, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Washington Press Corps. And the way in which they collided, interacted, the internal dynamics in each of these groups, how they worked through all of these issues, is really the story that this film tells. I should mention it's taken about 3 years to do all the interviewing and collect all the material, and we were very lucky that in addition to excerpts from the TV networks, we were able to get a lot of fascinating footage, including home movies taken by Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, and by one of the correspondents who went on the trip, Tom Jarrell. And most interestingly, I learned about 1.5 years ago at the Nixon Library that Nixon had hired a film crew to chronicle the trip for his own personal use. He did this through a famous movie producer named David Wolper, who produced Roots and a number of other well-known films. And this crew shot all the news events, but was also given access behind the scenes that none of the other reporters had at the time. And their instructions were to essentially shoot everything. And so then for nearly 40 years, there was a huge fight over who the film belonged to. No one could figure out whether it belonged to the Nixon family or the Nixon estate or to the government or the National Archives. And only this past summer was it determined that it did in fact belong to the National Archives, and we only got a hold of it in the fall. And it's never been released before, and it's high quality 16mm film, and many of the most interesting kind of behind the scenes glimpses of Nixon, of the press, of a lot of the events comes from this footage, and it's really, really fascinating. It was a very interesting experience to go through. So with that, if we can turn the lights down, we'll get started. Nixon called this the week that changed the world, and while I tend to dismiss what a lot of politicians say as hyperbole, I think in this case it was certainly true in terms of the geopolitics, and I think it was equally true in terms of the media, as I hope you will see from this movie. So we need to get the other lights off, and then we'll get started.
Those of you who are facing that way, if you want to just flip around your chairs for the next hour and face that way, you're welcome to, or if you have a good view there, just those of you in these rows can turn around.
All right, okay.
This very moment, through the wonder of telecommunications,
Well, I heard a lot of laughter. I think a lot of people really enjoyed that. And we have the special privilege this evening of having the editor, writer, producer, narrator of the show right here with us. So who would like to ask the first question? Marty.
Just a little point. You credited Henry Tang. Is that?
Not this Henry.
That's all I wanted to know.
Who's next? Back over there, please. Eric.
Hi, Mike and Keith, Eric Wisher, AFP. Very practical question. I thought that was fascinating. Congratulations. Purely practical question. How can you see this? I mean, how is it accessible on the internet, or is it? I mean, because I'd love to show my, the reporters in AFP this. I mean, it's just a fantastic document.
Yeah, this is available online at if you go to the website of the U.S. China Institute, which is simply china.usc.edu. You come to the homepage and you'll see there are actually two films that are available. One I also showed here a year and a half ago. Some of you may have come to seen it, which is called Opening Up, which is the story of the first generation of American reporters who opened bureaus in Beijing after the normalization of relations. But you'll see it'll say Assignment China, the week that changed the world. You can click on it, and there's a version with Chinese subtitles as well if you want to share it with Chinese friends. I would like, given the way this has not been on a television network for a variety of reasons, but it is available. We have a YouTube channel as well. And to the extent that any of you feel able to go to our website and find that link and put it on your Facebook page or tweet it or otherwise spread the word so that more people can see it, we would be very appreciative.
A modern social media way to promote something about media before social media.
Right.
Okay, do we have somebody out on the veranda? Over here, please.
What the film seemed to demonstrate to me was two things which came out very clearly. Firstly, the cynicism of Nixon and his objectives on this trip, purely political, absolutely cynical. There was no agenda. It was simply for political purposes. And the other striking thing was the naivety, if I put it that way, of the US press corps. They thought they'd landed on the moon. They didn't know what the hell was happening in China. How could they be so naive? Incredible to me. Thank you.
Well-
Your views?
Well, I would say two things on Nixon's motives. I was not in my youth a fan of Richard Nixon. I spent more time out demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. But I must say, I think they absolutely cynically saw this as something that would advance his political interest in his reelection process. But he did have a strategic, a greater strategic goal here. I mean, this was designed to create pressure on the Soviets by forging a relationship with the Chinese. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and it did have a significant impact. So I think you have to give Nixon and Kissinger some credit for having a kind of a geopolitical sense, but they certainly structured it for maximum political effect, and it worked. He won a landslide victory, which is why it's so ironic that he didn't have to do any of the stuff that was done in Watergate in order to advance his political objectives, because he would have run away with the election without it. In terms of the press, you're right. On the other hand, from 1949 until this trip, with a couple of exceptions in 1971, essentially the American media had not been allowed into China. You had a core of China watchers, including your dad, who we should acknowledge is the Henry Bradshaw in the film, and also the guy with the big furry hat writing in the notebook, who was a China watcher here in Hong Kong. There were people who followed it, but on this particular trip, there were 4 or 5 people who went who actually knew something about Asia. I mean, you literally count them. There was Henry Bradshaw, there was Stanley Carno of the Washington Post, Bernard Kalb of CBS, who'd been in Asia throughout most of the 50s and 60s. Ted Koppel had been ABC's Hong Kong bureau chief from 69 to 71, and Teddy White. But other than that, it was the people on the trip were a combination of the big anchors, the big commentators, people that Nixon liked from the Des Moines Register, people that he thought would be favorable to him. James Michener, the author, William F. Buckley, the columnist. It was a very odd collection of people. So you had very few people who knew anything about China to begin with. And secondly, I remember sitting in my living room watching this, and it was like watching the moon landing. In point of fact, until Nixon went to China, there had been more minutes of live coverage on American television from the moon than there had been from China. I mean, it really was that. And so there is this kind of, gosh, here we are. Look around, wow, they have bicycles here. People have families here. They have farms. And the reporters who wanted to try and get beyond that, of whom there were relatively few, were stymied at every opportunity. Just because you were in China didn't mean you were going to learn anything, because the Chinese weren't going to tell you, and the Nixon people were very happy to keep the focus on Nixon, and they didn't want reporters digging into what was actually going on in China. So I think the main impact in terms of the reporters was simply humanizing China. I mean, these were the blue ants. These were the enemy. We'd fought them in Korea. They'd gone crazy in the Cultural Revolution. So simply that the Chinese were like people who had kids and lives was itself, I think, a big step forward. But your broader point about the level of ignorance is absolutely true. And the reporters themselves that I spoke to, they recognized it.
Okay. Who? Over here, please.
Would the history be different if there were Chinese experts in the delegation?
Chinese
experts,
in the
watchers.
In the press.
In this whole delegation.
Well, Nixon had China experts, but he didn't listen to them. In fact, because Nixon and Kissinger so distrusted the State Department, they wouldn't even let the State Department's own translators in on the key meetings. Chas Freeman, who was the State Department's top Chinese speaker, was deliberately excluded from the meeting with Mao because Nixon didn't trust the State Department. their logic was, we're doing something that's so politically explosive in the States that we can't let anything leak. And that's why they didn't tell anyone. And given that he was essentially betraying his political base, which was the right-wing, conservative, pro-Taiwan constituency, you can sort of understand why they thought that way. As it was, the way he sold it to that constituency was to say, this is my master stroke to outfox the Russians, and the Russians are going to, we've really created a problem for them in reshaping the global balance of power, and therefore you have to put up with me essentially throwing Taiwan off the cliff.
Okay. Who next? Coming up here, please.
So, following this trip, what happened next? Like a lot of trips to Mars or, space trips, people ask, when do we go back?
Right. Well, what happened, I mean, lots of things happened next, but I would say the most relevant were in '73, the US and China agreed that each country could open a liaison office in the other country's capital, which was not an embassy that meant establishing diplomatic relations, but it meant having a diplomatic presence. And Nick Platt actually was part of the group that went in '73 and opened the US liaison office. And it's a diplomatic fiction, but it allowed them to deal with each other. In terms of the press, in '73, the Chinese let each of the big networks in to do a documentary. Ted Koppel went back for 10 weeks in 1973 and did a long film, and that will, in a subsequent episode of my project, I'm going to talk about all of that. And there were occasional tightly controlled visits by some reporters. Also, this helped strengthen the hand in China of the more so-called moderate faction, the more pragmatic group of people who wanted to put ideology to the side and kind of rebuild China. And it's not entirely a coincidence that in '73, Deng Xiaoping, who'd been purged in the Cultural Revolution, was brought back by Zhou Enlai with Mao's acquiescence and put in charge of the economy. And so I think internally in China, it was important for strengthening the hand of that group, which meant that in '76, when the Madame Mao and the Gang of Four made their big push to power, it strengthened the forces that were against that, who essentially ousted her after Mao's death. Obviously, tons more happened, but those are the highlights. Some of the highlights.
While people think about maybe one or two more questions, you're working on another episode. I guess you're looking for support for that episode,
well, I mean,
particularly in Hong Kong.
we have an episode that is done now on the Chinese Civil War of the 1940s. It's almost done, except I showed this film at Stanford, and afterwards a very elderly man came up and said, "Oh, I worked for UPI in Shanghai in 1948, and I happen to have my video camera, so I have to add him to that episode." But I'm working now on an episode about Hong Kong, on China watching in Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, because before Hong Kong became synonymous with economic boom, the miracle of that it evolved into, its key role in many ways internationally in the 50s and much of the 60s was as the listening post, where a very interesting collection of journalists and diplomats and spies and so forth sat here and tried to read the tea leaves on the other side of the quote-unquote bamboo curtain. And it's a very interesting episode, and I'm in the process of acquiring a lot of fascinating material. And the big challenge in doing these things is that the networks and the video and photo agencies charge a lot of money for the rights. CBS News charges more than $100 per second for use of video clips here. So there's a little flyer there. We're constantly looking for any kind of support, small, medium, or large. If you're an American, it's tax-free donation to the University of Southern California. If you know any wealthy business person who's very interested in the history of Hong Kong and might feel that preserving and helping people understand that part of Hong Kong's history is valuable, please spread the word, because that's the only way we can get this done. And I will, of course, make sure the Hong Kong premiere of that episode is here.
We're looking forward to that one as well. And it almost sounds like a segue for me to remind you now about Richard Hughes coming up Monday, and the IRS is coming to get you, overseas Americans.
So
on
donate
Tuesday.
a lot to the U.S.-China Institute and
donate
you
to
can
the
reduce your
US-China.
IRS bill.
Exactly. Do we have one more question here to wrap it up? Well, if not, why don't I just put in one more? What to you was sort of the biggest surprise as somebody who has spent now more years than almost anybody else in this room covering China? There must have still been something that when you went into looking at that period 40 years ago, you said, I mean, and you're familiar with the Shanghai communique in particular, having lived in Taiwan where people still talk about it so much. What was the biggest surprise to you? What do you think people really don't appreciate and you didn't even know before you started doing this?
I think one of the things that struck me was, with the benefit of hindsight, it all seems preordained. Nixon went to China, they had the Shanghai communique, the door was open. But this was a very risky venture on multiple levels, diplomatically and even in terms of the press. And there are so many points during the course of this that it really could have gone off the rails when you think about it. I mean, first, politically, Nixon was antagonizing his own base. And in China, Lin Biao, Mao's designated heir, had died after some attempt against Mao just a few months earlier in September of '71, a story which your dad was instrumental in breaking, I should say. But there were severe internal tensions with China, inside China, over the wisdom of this opening to the States. So both leaders were taking big political risks. They did not have an agreement before Nixon arrived on a communique on all the language. I mean, normally today, no presidential trip would go anywhere if the lower rungs hadn't actually got everything worked out in advance. So there were big political risks. There are other kinds of risks which seem kind of silly in retrospect, but for a security-obsessed American president, he entrusted his physical security to the Chinese without any guarantee that they wouldn't haul off and shoot him or who knows what. I mean, he drove Chinese cars, he went on Chinese planes. He basically said to Zhou Enlai, "I trust you with my life," which for a country that had been an American enemy, there was a risk. And in terms of the press, the fact that all this live stuff happened I've been on enough live coverage episodes when I was at CNN where the feed crashed, it was green, there was no audio, all the things that can go wrong. It all worked. And even in the difficult encounters the press had, Dan Rather's minders made him go back to the hotel. Nobody hit him over the head with things that happened to reporters that could have really soured the atmosphere. So there's so many places in which this could have gone wrong that when you kind of relive it, you sense it, because no one knew from day to day what the next day was going to bring. And that really kind of struck me, that there was a much more of a high wire act than it appears with the benefit of hindsight.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for coming. If you'd like to stay after,
Happy to do so.
Mike would be happy to talk to you, and we hope to see you at more of our events coming up. Thank you all for coming.